On the one hand, it's exciting that there is this great research that's coming out. We know more about these trades than we did ever before. But at the same time, it's thoroughly depressing because I feel like we've done this exact conversation, this exact show 10 times before, and nothing is changing. That everybody is complicit here. We as consumers are complicit. Governments are complicit. African governments are complicit. The Chinese governments are complicit. The corporations are complicit. And yet nothing seems to change.
I really think the corruption is the enabling factor. The conflict is an enabling factor. But we're really also shining a light on the failure of shipping lines to do anything about it because they are also aware. They post on their own sites on CMA and Maersk a lot of the news from these countries they ship from. And they've posted many times about the illegal timber sector in Mozambique. They should be aware, I know they are now, of the actual law on the books.
One of the reasons why these forests are declining is because of the larger structural economic position of the countries they're in. Countries that are under enormous pressure to sell off anything in order to, to function within the global economy.
We're still getting a fair amount of response, so the story's not over. We haven't heard any response from the Chinese side. I do know that some of the social media accounts from the traders who were openly advertising in China the sale of these imported goods from Mozambique that were illegal, some of them have switched their accounts to private, so they must have been alerted to the report.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, as we've been saying all year, this is a FOCAC year, that is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The summit is going to be held sometime later this year. You'll probably get sick of us talking about this, but it is going to be the big story for at least the next 6 months. And we don't know exactly when. I'm starting to hear rumors that it might be in September, although I'm a little skeptical that it'll be that early. It won't be in October because that's the big Golden Week holiday for the Chinese for the first week and a half of the month. So it might be in November. That's where I put my money down, is November. But interestingly, Cobus, environment so far has not been a prominent topic, at least in the early chat around FOCAC. And that's surprising in part because in the last FOCAC, if you recall, from Dakar, they actually issued a separate declaration specifically on climate change. And Chinese propaganda afterwards, you said this, and let me just read it to you. The declaration on climate change states that both sides unanimously advocate innovative, coordinated, green, open, and shared sustainable development and strive to promote the green recovery of the world economy after the COVID-19 pandemic. The reason I bring this up is because environment is a major talking point, and I think we have to give the Chinese credit in some areas, such as energy, solar panels. Now EVs are coming to Africa and other countries in the global south. But in some other areas, the Chinese and their African partners have failed miserably and have really not done much at all. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about the timber trade in Mozambique. And I know a lot of people are going to think to themselves, wait, didn't you just talk about the timber trade in Equatorial Guinea? And didn't we talk about earlier the illegal timber trade in Nigeria and Cameroon that was facilitating illegal trafficking and all sorts of other things? And then previously, haven't we been talking about illegal Chinese fishing in Ghana? And so the list of these illicit environmental crimes involving the Chinese, not necessarily exclusively done by the Chinese, but involved by the Chinese, undermines a lot of this rhetoric that we see at FOCAC. And Cobus, it just seems to me that the flowery rhetoric that we see from these declarations isn't backed up by a lot of enforcement action by the Chinese or by their African counterparts. And again, that's a broad statement, so we can't necessarily say everything, but enough to the point where the pace of environmental damage that's going on right now is really picking up, and it seems like governments on both sides aren't doing enough.
Yes, I mean, this stands in glaring contrast with a few things. One is that in China, Chinese forest management of Chinese forests is quite aggressive and quite successful. So there's a very strong kind of split, which we'll discuss, between Chinese involvement in foreign logging versus Chinese involvement in forest management within China. The other thing that's very interesting for me is we've discussed, and we will continue to discuss this in terms of environmental impact and deforestation and climate. But there's also the framing, where the logging discussion is akin to something like critical minerals, where of course there's a lot of pressure from African governments, led particularly by the government of Zimbabwe, to force Chinese companies to locate refining of critical minerals in Africa and to not export critical minerals in its raw form. One could make a similar kind of argument about timber, and it's interesting how that discussion is very different. And it's interesting to kind of position the discussion of timber also in this kind of like beneficiation of resources discussion that's happening around minerals. It's interesting to see the kind of siloing of these discussions.
Well, the reason why we're talking about timber now, and specifically Mozambique, is because a new report came out from the Environmental Investigation Agency that wraps up a multi-year investigation into the fact that millions of tons of illegal timber from Mozambique, including conflict timber, is exported to China and then turned into luxury furniture. Let me just give you a couple of the details of this report, this investigation that was done by EIA. They said that 89% of the timber exports from Mozambique to China between 2017 and 2023, which is equivalent to 3.7 million tons, worth around $1.3 billion, was shipped in breach of this national export ban that they've had. So, Cobus, to your point about exporting raw, unprocessed minerals, also with timber. And also, just like they did with their previous report on the role that Home Depot played in the timber trade between Equatorial Guinea and China, they also singled out the huge French shipping company CGM, the Danish shipping company Maersk, and the shipping company MSC that played an important role in all of this. Let's get a perspective now on that report and drill down into it. We're thrilled to be joined today by Alex Bloom, who's a senior trade and policy analyst at EIA. She is a specialist in the illegal timber supply chains linked to Asia, and really happy to have you here with us, Alex, to help us uncover what the EIA team found in this report. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. Let's start again with some of those big numbers that I read. Give us the headlines of some of the key findings of your multi-year investigation into what was happening between Mozambique and China.
So we have been investigating the timber trade and illegal timber sector in Mozambique since approximately late 2020, early 2021. And what we found has been just massive volumes of timber leaving Mozambique illegally. Most of that illegal because it is in log form in breach of that log export ban. And almost all of that wood, almost all those logs are shipped to China. On average, 500,000 tons per year in log form. In addition to that, it is in the context of massive deforestation in the country that's lost over half of its forest cover since the 1980s, and an enabling environment of corruption. And unfortunately, the province we were focused on is Cabo Delgado in the north of the country of Mozambique. And there has been an insurgency there, displacing massive numbers of people and causing violence since 2017 as well. And we found from our interviews that sources described that the timber that is traded from Mozambique, and in particular from Cabo Delgado, does include wood that was purchased from insurgents, and insurgents are benefiting from this trade to raise money for their operations.
So if we trace the trail of this timber, it's illegally logged in Cabo Delgado. And how does the process go from there? I wonder if you could just kind of give us a kind of a brief outline of the entire route that the timber follows.
Yeah, so the way we got interested in this actually is that we learned in late 2020, early 2021 about the shipment ongoing on the high seas of about 80 containers of illegal wood that had just left Mozambique on the lam and was headed to China. And actually, with EIA's intervention and coordination with Maersk Shipping Line and authorities in Mozambique, we were able to make sure most of that wood was not unloaded in China and actually was returned to the port of Pemba in Cabo Delgado, where it had shipped from. From there, that's where we started studying the actors involved in the illegal trade in Cabo Delgado. So what we learned is that the trade in Cabo Delgado is really dominated by Chinese traders. It is almost all Asian traders and mostly Chinese traders who are collecting, buying timber, and they do so in their sawmill operations in Montepuez, which is the second largest city and a hub city in Cabo Delgado. That is where the sawmills are located, and that's where we can see in some satellite imagery and where sources told us that the wood was being brought from all across the province, from legal and illegal sources, including from insurgents, and packaged all together into containers, and then from there trucked to ports for export, including the port of Pemba, and then in more recent years, they've been trucked to the port of Beira, further south in the country, for most of the exports to China.
Can you tell us more about who these Chinese traders are? Are they newcomers to Mozambique, or have they been there a long time? Are they affiliated with large state-owned companies, or are they independent entities that operate in the gray market?
For the most part, these seem to be independent from large companies, and we didn't find too many newcomers. A lot of them, in fact, were names that had been reported in the UK location of EIA's report back in 2013 and 2014. EIA UK, which is our sister organization, had reported on the illegal timber sector in Mozambique over about 10 years ago, and some of the companies they named, like Mofid, are still doing business in spite of having been in the news and in that report exposed a number of times for engaging in illegal timber trade. So we didn't find too many newcomers. Some of the traders are trading not just timber products. We spoke with one in particular who's named in the report who does a lot of mining. In fact, the mining might be the majority of his business, and he is also trading timber.
So in an earlier report, EIA found that some wood from Equatorial Guinea ended up in kind of like mainstream, kind of like big box stores in the US, like Home Depot. In this case, the wood seems to be going to the Chinese luxury market. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Chinese companies involved, and also there's an allusion in the report also to the French luxury brand Hermès being involved. So I was wondering if you could just kind of unpack the destination of the timber.
Yes. So a lot of the species, most of the species commercially traded from Mozambique to China, can be considered Hongmu substitutes, and in one case is an official Hongmu species. I know you've talked a little bit on the show previously, but Hongmu is an official designation in China of 29 species of precious rosewood, and they're considered precious for traditional and cultural reasons. And they've been used and continue to be used for making luxury reproduction antique furniture. And those can be sold for tens or even hundreds of $1,000 sets of furniture. Now, as those species of official Hongmu have become harder and harder to find because their stocks are depleted, there's increasing pressure on other high-value species that have similar properties, which are considered Hongmu substitutes. And a lot of, if not the majority, if not all of the most traded species from Mozambique, including Umbila and Jambire, are considered Hongmu substitutes. And the official Hongmu species that Mozambique does trade is Pau Preto. That's Dalbergia melanoxylon. So these are all high-value species that are exported to China and then turned in, the most part, into these antique-style furniture. In fact, notably at the G20 that China hosted in 2016, the heads of state were all seated on beautiful chairs that had been commissioned to be made from Pau Preto, from Mozambique.
Wow. I guess the part that I don't understand, and I'm really glad you're here because you have a background in Chinese supply chains for this type of trade, is that we've talked about over the years about the illegal timber trade coming out of Congo-Brazzaville, out of the DRC, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, and now Mozambique. And if we know about it and you know about it, I presume that the Chinese government knows about it. The Chinese government has made declarations at FOCAC and others that says it will protect the environment. As you've pointed out, in Mozambique, half of the rainforest cover is gone. That is a similar situation in other countries as well, where deforestation is a big problem. Are the Chinese not clamping down on this trade because they can't, because it's illicit and it's difficult, it's like the drug trade, or because they don't care? Or what is it? Why does this trade continue to happen where the demand is pulling this from Africa? And we're talking now billions of dollars of, if it's just 1.3 billion in Mozambique, add up all the other countries of where illegal timber is coming out of, the number goes into the billions quickly. How is this continuing to happen that the Chinese simply aren't doing anything according to your investigation?
It's a good question. And it has been really disappointing to be in this space. When I started studying China many years ago, there was more dialogue possible. And in fact, when I joined EIA, we had conversations with agencies, the forestry agency in China that had jurisdiction over this. And these days, that kind of work is led by the Ministry of the Environment. And it's just become increasingly difficult to impossible to even get any acknowledgement or response from any official in China. They've had a lot of clamping down on who in China is allowed to speak to the press or foreign organizations. It's even difficult from anybody without a Chinese phone number to contact anyone in China. Those numbers get automatically screened or blocked. So the communication barrier has been deliberately made very non-transparent. And I've seen journalists in China, Chinese journalists, who had been able to cover these environmental topics, who no longer are. Those stories get taken down or are not allowed to be published. I don't think the issue is that the Chinese government is unable to do anything about it. I think it's a question of priorities. When the Chinese government decided to clamp down on ivory trafficking, they were able to do so quite successfully. Not to say there's no more trafficking, but there was a
No, but it's a lot less.
Exactly.
It's a lot less, that's for sure.
And China did reform its forestry law and just has yet to actually put in place any regulations to actually address all the inflows of illegal timber. So I really think it's a matter of political will, and they're just not sharing any of those communication lines with the outside world. But I don't know why this isn't a greater priority, especially given their stated commitments to FOCAC, memorandums of understanding with Mozambique and a number of other African countries, and their statements at the UN Climate Change Convention, Sunnyland statements stating that they are committed to fighting illegal deforestation.
Cobus, if I recall from the prior to 2017, and I think it was 2017, and somebody please look this up, when the ivory ban went into place, that part of the reason the Chinese acted on ivory was because they were under enormous pressure from African governments who felt that the diminished population of elephants was hurting their tourism business. And it was African governments, I think, that made the difference on ivory. Do you get the sense that African governments are putting the same pressure on the Chinese for timber and other resources?
No, I'm not. I think African governments have been relatively slow, I think, in defining forest assets as assets. And, we're seeing a move in that direction slowly. There's been, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo joined a group of forest-heavy countries, as a kind of a grouping to discuss some of these issues at the previous COP gathering, for example. So there is this kind of like now and then these kind of movements, but I don't think African governments have put nearly the same kind of pressure on China, particularly in a FOCAC context, to help to preserve these assets. It'll be very interesting to see whether this FOCAC and ongoing kind of gatherings, whether they actually move in that direction. Alex, I was wondering, bringing it back to the Mozambican side, the report mentions that the Mozambican government has actually, implemented several measures to try and kind of stop this illegal trade. Why did they fail? Like, what are the dynamics involved that weaken this regulation?
Yes. In 2002, Mozambique put in place a log export ban on Class 1 species, which was a listed subset of species. And then that was expanded in 2017 to be a log export ban on all native species, which covers most of the commercially important ones. And in fact, they've just further expanded that as of December 2023 to cover all species. So the log export ban, in my view, the regulation is quite good. And what it's lacking is serious enforcement. And unfortunately, what we heard time after time from sources in the interviews was that the corruption was really pervasive. And people at every level, forest inspectors, customs officials, and higher up people and at the ports are paid to look the other way. And we even heard about a sort of symbiotic relationship between the Chinese businessmen and the party officials and other officials in Mozambique. So they're benefiting and being hurt on both sides from this bribe arrangement. I really think the corruption is the enabling factor. The conflict is an enabling factor. But we're really also shining a light on the failure of shipping lines to do anything about it, because they are also aware. They post on their own sites on CMA and Maersk a lot of the news from these countries they ship from. And they've posted many times about the illegal timber sector in Mozambique. They should be aware, I know they are now, of the actual law on the books. And we've recommended strongly that shipping lines not ship any timber from Mozambique until they're able to keep off the illegal logs and any conflict timber on their ships.
So Mozambique ranks 145 out of 180 on Transparency International's corruption index. That's not very good. That's close to the bottom, obviously. That is a similar situation in the DR Congo, in Equatorial Guinea, and in a number of these countries that are exporting huge amounts of illegal timber. Given that corruption is what it is, and just on the point of the CMA, CGM, I can imagine one of the things that they might say is that they get paperwork for a lot of this logs that looks perfectly legitimate, has all the right stamps, has all the right signatures on it, ready to go. It's got all the export permissions to go, but those were illegally secured. So the question is, what do you do in a country that is ranked 145 out of 180 and has weak state capacity and weak governance and doesn't have any, there's not a forecast for this to change anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we really are putting the responsibility on three parties here. The Mozambique authorities need to wake up and really start reforming the sector and working on corruption and really enforcing their own laws. And the Chinese government also needs to respect Mozambican laws. They've claimed that they respect the sovereignty of other countries. They need to start by not allowing imports, a massive flood of imports of illegal wood. And the shipping lines need to do better, much better. You're correct that they get all sorts of nice paperwork. They would claim to receive all the right signatures on the papers. Those don't supersede a national law that was passed in 2017 banning all log exports. And none of those individual papers they may have inspected, they may say they've inspected that paperwork for that shipment, but it does not supersede the national law. And they're realizing that. And Maersk has also already been persuaded to cease shipping timber out of other conflict zones that are rife with corruption. They took action in Gambia last year or 2 years ago, I believe, when we brought a similar kind of situation to their attention.
But what was the response of Home Depot to your equatorial investigation?
Well, I did not actually work on that one, so I would defer to my colleague. I do believe Home Depot is in conversation with EIA, with the team that worked on that one. And I think their response is, I don't think the story is finished on that.
So naming and shaming works in your view?
It definitely is part of the solution. We have found, yes, these big shipping lines, at least Maersk, CMA, a lot of the bigger ones do care about their reputation. And they've also made commitments to fighting climate change and not trafficking in illegal wildlife products. So they want to look responsible to their shareholders.
The situation in Mozambique is complicated significantly by the fact that it's also a conflict and insurgency situation. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the insurgents. Like, what are they trying to achieve? You know, we've seen many reports over time that there's, Islamist insurgency in Cabo Delgado, but, there's less discussion about what that is supposed to head towards. And then also, how specifically does this logging help them?
So I'm not a specialist in Islamist movements. And as I mentioned, I came at this from the China trade angle and also sort of through this renegade shipment in 2021 that we were able to turn back. And it was by studying the actors involved that we started seeing the links to the insurgency and seeing that the Chinese traders were buying timber from all sorts of sources, including illegal forests where they were not allowed to log, and including from insurgents. The sources told us that they would often buy through middlemen deliberately to obscure the link to the insurgents. I believe the insurgents traffic in all sorts of illicit goods to try to fundraise for their operations, ivory and pangolin and other wildlife products, and as well as other kinds of trafficking, drug trafficking. I think it's just whatever is convenient that can raise any kind of money.
Help us put what's going on in Mozambique in some context, and Africa more broadly, as you study Chinese timber supply chains. Is Mozambique a major part of the timber supply chain into China? When we look at, say, this is also happening in Southeast Asia as well. Here in Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar are also sources of illegal timber as well. What's the context that we're looking at here?
Mozambique is definitely a huge source of logs and timber for China, and especially of tropical logs. It's been in the top 3 African sources of logs for China in the last 5-6 years, alongside Equatorial Guinea, Republic of Congo, Cameroon. So it's definitely an enormous part of Chinese timber supply. We're talking millions of tons, millions of cubic meters, $1 billion. It's a top source. Why is it so important? I do think it's partly because it's a low-hanging fruit of opportunity. It's got a perfect storm of low governance capacity, poor forest governance, corruption, and conflict to boot. So it's an available country from which to import many resources, and it's also becoming an important mineral resource for China. As for Southeast Asia, that has traditionally been the top source of the most traditional species of hongwu, that precious rosewood. But a lot of those stocks have become commercially depleted over time. And that is what led Chinese traders through the 90s and early 2000s to start looking for other hongwu species abroad. I believe one of the first sources of non-Southeast Asian timber, non-Southeast Asian hongwu that was pinpointed and overexploited was in Madagascar. And then many other African countries, many of them in West Africa, followed.
It's very easy to feel completely despairing about the situation, particularly the way that it kind of overlaps, climate and development and corruption and governance and, all of these different, it feels a little bit like like an almost impossible battle. But you were also alluding in our conversation before we started recording, you alluded to some successes in some African countries. So I was wondering, considering the realities of corruption and, low government capacity, what kind of recommendations would you make to African governments that are actually trying to improve the situation? What are some things that African governments can actually do to help the situation?
Well, I believe you're referring to Gabon, where we've seen the country has had pretty big success with imposing and enforcing a log export ban. And as a result, the domestic processing industry has really taken off. And that's a lot of revenue for the state and jobs created for Gabon. And they're exporting sawn and other processed wood. So there's a lot more value added there. We've also had success on regulating one of the most overexploited African hongwu species, which was Pterocarpus erinaceus, known as koso, in West Africa. We were seeing massive plunder. There was an enormous amount, for example, in 2014 from Nigeria that was being shipped, just enormous quantities, but in log form to China. But at CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade for Endangered Species, there was a successful push to actually bar the trade in that species from, I believe, 12 or 16 countries, most of them West Africa and Congo Basin. And that has made a huge dent in export of koso. That's actually been a pretty big success in protecting that species. We're seeing a little bit of weakening there. Mali is trying to reinitiate that trade. But if you look at that, there's been a dramatic drop in exports of that species. And it's unfortunately probably slightly because of that traders have now re-emphasized other substitutes and have now Mozambique is the number one source of African hongwu to China. So it is possible to act.
And have you received any feedback? I know the report just came out, so it's still relatively new, but any response or feedback from any of the actors that are named in the report, either the companies, the Chinese embassies, the Mozambican government? Anybody responded to it?
We're still getting a fair amount of response, so the story's not over. We haven't heard any response from the Chinese side. I do know that some of the social media accounts from the traders who were openly advertising in China the sale of these imported goods from Mozambique that were illegal, some of them have switched their accounts to private, so they must have been alerted to the report. We are in conversation with two of the shipping lines, and we think that things are headed in a good direction there. We do think that they've been motivated to really seriously improve their due diligence on the timber shipping from Mozambique. And we have also heard from the State Department, the U.S. State Department, including the embassy in Mozambique, that would like to have further conversations, but I don't know what the subject will be yet.
But you're really not expecting a response from the Chinese, are you, based on what you've seen in previous reports?
No, we used to make a concerted outreach. This time we didn't because it's just been radio silence for the last few years.
The report is Shipping the Forest. It details millions of tons of illegal timber from Mozambique, including conflict timber that's exported to China for luxury furniture. It is a multi-year investigation conducted by the Environmental Investigation Agency. They do some amazing work. We'll put a link to the report in the show notes. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Alex Bloom is a senior trade and policy analyst at the Environmental Investigation Agency, where she investigates illegal timber supply chains linked to Asia. So thank you for your time, and we really appreciate the great work that you and the EIA team are doing on these reports.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Cobus, I have a weird feeling after these conversations when we talk about illegal timber, fishing, pangolin, ivory, any of these things. On the one hand, it's exciting that there is this great research that's coming out. We know more about these trades than we did ever before. But at the same time, it's thoroughly depressing because I feel like we've done this exact conversation, this exact show 10 times before, and nothing is changing. That everybody is complicit here. We as consumers are complicit. Governments are complicit. African governments are complicit. The Chinese governments are complicit. The corporations are complicit. And yet nothing seems to change. And, the sands in the hourglass are running down for us on climate change. And we're cutting down these forests that are really one of our last hopes to combat, the changing climate. And yet no one seems motivated enough to do anything about it.
Definitely. I share the despair. I think that is true, but I think it's true if one zooms out. When one zooms in and you go to specific case studies, I think, as Alex has shown, that there is the potential for actual progress. It's just this kind of really granular fight where it's like, fighting for species by species and kind of having the, illegal loggers and so on regrouping and shifting and adapting in the process. So it's an ongoing kind of long, hard slog, but I think it definitely is possible to do something. I think what is really the kind of missing piece here is for global south countries with large forest assets, in the first place, to think of them as assets, to define them in that kind of way. And, there's a lot of that work being done in kind of climate academia, but it hasn't 100% kind of filtered out into the broader world. And the problem is that it's hard at the moment still for countries with large forests to just simply directly profit from maintaining those forests. If once some form of carbon credit, carbon trading, even though I know many people are extremely cynical for good reasons about carbon trading, but it does still in some kind of way offer at least some kind of economic framework within which a living forest can start to be worth more than the actual individual logs taken from it. And, so once that, I think, is our, on the wider front, that is our big challenge, is to find a way of having intact living forests being worth something, rather than just being thought of as a great collection of wood that should be cut down and sold off.
Hard to see that happening in the near term. Hard to see that happening in a massive collective way that would be effective, say the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, here in Southeast Asia, the tropical countries, just because the complexity of getting that many countries to agree is, I think, overwhelming in my view. I think the near term is just like what we saw with African countries putting pressure on the Chinese for ivory, that African countries have to get together and tell the Chinese at FOCAC, at embassy gatherings, at all the different venues that the Chinese and Africans engage one another at, this has to stop. That is the only way it stops, in my view. And we know that because ivory stopped for the most part. Not 100%, but a lot. The problem in Africa today in many countries, and it's a problem, is an overpopulation of elephants. And I say it's a problem only because there is now this uncomfortable interaction with elephants in human communities that isn't always pleasant. But that happened in part because African governments collectively rose up one after another, said, enough. This is impacting our tourism. It's impacting our national identities. The elephant is sacred. These forests are sacred as well. Now, I can't say anything. We're an outsider. This has to be an African-driven initiative in order to have the weight. The Chinese aren't going to listen to the State Department. They're not going to listen to EIA. They're not going to listen to Westerners on this, but they will listen to Africans.
Yeah, I mean, if China is embarrassed around FOCAC, around how, around the fact that they suck so much on this, that would be great.
It does, no, but it doesn't mean about embarrassing. Nobody's talking about embarrassing anybody. This is about backdoor pressure to say, stop, cut it out. You can cut it out, cut it out.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, it is also objectively embarrassing. I mean, it is, kind of like China really is terrible on this. And the Africans, kind of for all of the discussion in our circles around the need to elevate African agency, that discussion is very seldomly turned around and simply asking the question, why are African governments so incredibly disappointing around these issues? Why? So I think there's a little bit of embarrassment that should be spread around, I think, because this really is a terrible situation. But at the same time, as you say, kind of like it'll like that is only a tool. The real kind of place where the action will happen will be behind closed doors in diplomatic circles. But hopefully the more kind of like discussion of this in the media, and particularly in African media, I think is crucial for, in order to kick off that diplomatic discussion.
And there's got to be this acknowledgement that because of weak state capacity, that the supply side is too difficult to manage. So Mozambique is incapable because of the insurgency and corruption and poverty and a number of issues from actually implementing effective policy here. But the demand side, China has very high state capacity, very, very solid governance. It can stop this if it wants to. As Alex talked about, it's a question of priorities. And African governments just have to move this up the priority list if they want it to stop. And if they do that, I think they can have change. That, to me, is the shortest path to curtailing some of this. Because at the end of the day, we're going to wake up in 10, 15 years, and Mozambique is going to be a desert with no tree cover, right? I mean, if their half is gone since, the 90s now, It's not going to take long for the other half to go. And we all suffer because we depend on these trees for the oxygen that we breathe. Now, again, that gets into some weird territory because the global north has done so much to devastate the environment. The global south is paying the price for it. And so the burden to fix this can't be entirely on Mozambique.
Well, there obviously is the issue. I think the other issue I think that is really important is to position forests in the context of these countries' larger financial issues, right? Kind of, which is particularly a lot of debt in different African countries. Not all of them, but a lot of them have significant debt issues. So there it then kind of connects to the broader issue around not only debt, but also development finance. And so, for example, I was at a very interesting conference last year where experts on debt for climate swaps were talking about the actual mechanisms of enforcing some of these things. And it's a very interesting field. It's a kind of an emerging field in kind of environment/development studies. And, there's talk, for example, about the proposed schemes being floated around in academic circles around, for example, kind of if one is an indebted country with large forest assets, then there's debt for nature swaps where that asset starts actually functioning as an asset. And then these proposals that there'd be ongoing tracking, of forest cover. And if the forest cover declines over time because of corruption-related illegal logging, then that would then, kind of like there'd be certain kind of pennies dropping, kind of with measures kind of landing on the debt burden of the country. So as long as the forest cover is maintained, that debt doesn't need to be repaid. It's essentially repaid in oxygen by the forest. When the forest declines, then the debt kicks back into action. So, I can foresee some kind of complaints from global south countries about those mechanisms, but at the same time, I think there are actual solutions, particularly not only in saving the forests themselves, but in recognizing that one of the reasons why these forests are declining is because of the larger structural economic position of the countries they're in. Kind of countries that are under enormous pressure to sell off anything in order to, to function within the global economy. So, kind of, I think we need broader and embedded kind of solutions, which is easy to say and difficult to do. But, kind of, I think this kind of like discussion about not only siloing it in terms of nature conservation, for example, but positioning it in the context of youth bulge, demographic need for development, et cetera, all of these things need to be taken into account at once.
Let's quickly pivot before we go. I want to get your take on something. I got some email today from some of our readers who said, wait a minute, Eric, on Monday of this or Tuesday of this week, Cobus wrote how railway financing in Africa may be on the upswing. And then on Wednesday of this week, you wrote me that it's probably not on the upswing. We're getting very conflicting messages this week. If you've been following some of the news going on in a number of African countries, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Nigeria in particular, lots of excitement about the Chinese coming back into the railway financing sector. And I cautioned that, watch out. And there were two headlines in particular that I want to bring everybody's attention to. So in Nairametrics, which is a very big Nigerian economic website, they said China commits to funding Ibadan, Abuja, and Kaduna Kanu rail lines, transport minister. And then Business Daily on the same day in Kenya had a headline that said China commits to fund Kenya-Uganda joint railway project. The use of the word commits in both articles is super interesting. And again, I'm not suggesting that there's any kind of conspiracy there. My take on this was, whoa. We have not heard from any of the Chinese on this. This has been a pattern over the past few years where African policymakers and leaders come out and declare that the Chinese are back to fund a project. They never do, the Chinese, because they've gotten out of this very large-scale infrastructure financing space in Africa. Don't forget that in 2022, the total Chinese development finance lending, according to Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, was just $922 million. That's in 2022. It has not picked up dramatically since then. So all of a sudden now we're going to go to $6, $7, $8, $9 billion of railways, especially loaning to a country like Kenya that's struggling to pay back its loans for the first railways that the Chinese built. This doesn't make sense. So all I wanted to do was flag that to people that something doesn't feel right about all this we've been going on this week.
Well, so we have to put that in context, right? Kind of because the story that I was focusing on when I said that there seems
that was
to be
Zimbabwe
a
in particular, right?
Exactly, is a more specific memorandum of understanding that was signed between the Zimbabwean state rail authorities and China Rail around a possible recapitalization of the Zimbabwean National Rail Service that also would draw in a bunch of other companies. So that seems to be a lot more concrete, kind of like compared to the Nigerian and Kenyan ones. Those are very vague, and also, like as you say, like the weird similar wording and the way that they popped up at the same time, and also the way that the rest of the national media didn't pick up on the story. All of those kind of like raised flags. In the case of the Zimbabwean one, it's a lot more concrete. There seems to be like actual public kind of acknowledgement of some kind of deal by the company. So that's interesting. We should also note that China, despite, as you say, there's been very sharp kind of policy bank kind of pullback on lending for this kind of infrastructure in Africa, but Chinese companies are still involved in different kinds of rail sectors around the continent. And some readers have mentioned also that there seems to be kind of action happening in Morocco, for example, like some in North Africa. So, so it's a very kind of complicated field. And at the same time, the big trouble that we always face is not only that these deals are complicated, but then also the press coverage of them is so tricky that one always has to be extremely careful. And this is exactly what we were picking up in terms of the Kenya and Nigeria thing. It's like we were like, wait, why is this weird wording coming up? And what does commit mean? Etc., etc. Like, why is the same thing popping up in both Nigeria and Kenya almost within the same week? It's all very strange. So we'll keep tracking it and see what happens.
Yeah, we'll keep tracking it. And to your point, it hasn't all stopped. So Guinea, for example, is in the process of negotiating a massive railway deal with the Chinese, but that's connected to the Samandu iron ore mine. And I suspect in Zimbabwe as well that there's probably a motivation for lithium that the...
Yes, I think that is already clear, I think, yes.
Exactly. So that makes sense. But bringing the SGR from Naivasha in the Rift Valley to the Ugandan border, which is, by the way, a part of the standard gauge railway that China, on multiple occasions over the past 8 or 9 years, has said they don't want to finance at concessional rates. I mean, Uhuru Kenyatta went to China multiple times to try and get financing for this. One of the reasons why the China Exim Bank balked at financing this is because there isn't the density of population and the density of industry or natural resources that would allow this line to pay back the debt. And so they're concerned about it. None of that has changed. The financial fundamentals of both Nigeria and Kenya have worsened in recent years because of the weakening currencies, because of increased debt loads, all sorts of different reasons. So again, this doesn't make a lot of sense on those two. Nigeria has a benefit, though, because it's got this massive population that it can put on trains and charge tickets for. So revenue starts to come in faster in a place like Nigeria than in Western Kenya.
I think that's all true. And I think in the East African case, though, I think one should maybe be careful or balance a view, a what's possible in Beijing view, which is realistic and important. That's an important kind of like perspective on it. But one should also keep in mind that this kind of like cross-regional East African railway network, the standard gauge railways / the other, kind of the ones that are also being planned in Tanzania, for example, that has been a long-term East African kind of project that is continuing despite China having lost some interest, I think. So China was a very big player in it, and some Chinese companies remain big players in it, but the East Africans are actively kind of looking around for all kinds of contractors and investors, including in places like Turkey, for example. And it's one of these things where individually these rail lines don't make commercial sense. But however, once everything is connected, once you have harbors on the Indian Ocean connected to the DRC, for example, right, kind of which is the big plan of this network in the long run, then it's a different situation, right? Kind of like once you can export from the DRC via Tanzania or Kenya, then the DRC doesn't have to export via Durban in South Africa anymore. And that's a completely different kind of mix of situations.
And of course, the Libido corridor. Let's not forget about what the Americans are doing there. Yes, and so this network you're talking about is moving forward in fits and starts. So Tanzania is probably moving most aggressively, and they're, again, not using Chinese financing for any of it. So that's really very interesting. Also, just to keep in mind that these railways and then the Chinese financing of it may evolve in very different ways. The point that I'm trying to make is that we're not going to see another $6 billion loan the way there was for the first standard gauge railway. Those days are gone. But do you remember we had a conversation with Torella Moses of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, and she talked about how Chinese development finance is rapidly changing right now, and it's de-risking. And so they're going to places like Singapore, into the capital markets there. They're partnering with banks like Standard Chartered. So we may see the Chinese come in as part of a bundle of financial services and financial operators, and they play a minority role, or they're coming in as EPC contractors, or they're coming in lots of different ways other than just write a big check. That's again why this coverage in Nigeria and Kenya was so lacking, is it didn't provide any of the details. When they say commits, we don't know what that means. We have no idea what that means. All I'm trying to say to people is just be a little bit cautious. And I'll leave you guys with one thought that said that Jeronima, our Africa editor, said, until you see an announcement from the Chinese that says a deal has been signed, don't believe any of it. That's what he said. So I'll leave it up to everybody else. The article is on our website, Why It May Be Premature to Trust Nigerian, Kenyan media reports on new Chinese railway funding. Love for you guys to check it out. Tell me what you think. I'll put a link also in the show notes. Cobus, let's leave the show there. Thank you again for another lively conversation. It's great to have these talks about the environment. We have to keep them up. It's so important. And it's the kind of coverage that we do every day on the China Global South project over at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And your subscriptions help keep the work we're doing alive. And I just got to keep telling everybody, it's not easy to stay alive as a media company today in 2024. All media is facing very serious challenges, and we're no exception. And so the only way we can do this is with your support. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, and you can check out the subscription options, very cheap, starting at $19 a month. If you are a student or teacher, just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. I will send you the links for half off of the subscription. So very, very cheap. And then also a big shout out to our Patreon supporters. Thank you so much for your support. Without all of your generous contributions, this show simply would not be possible. So for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back again with another edition of the China in Africa podcast.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.